Today, together, let us touch on, first of all, the importance of living a wholesome, healthy life. That is a life in accord with this practice, in accord with the Dharma, the living truth. Not just some practice that we do on our cushion for a while and then we get up and do things and, let's say, no longer live in accord with that truth. It may take some time, but naturally, the practice on the cushion and the rest of our life comes to be in accord quite naturally. You might say they're not exactly one, but they're not two either. Doing this, the faith, the trust, confidence in our practice grows, and naturally it starts to manifest, so to speak, out in the world, in the daily activities. In the beginning, it can be a bit difficult, but in time, if you are practicing correctly, our daily life and our practice reinforce each other. On the cushion, the basic practice, in a word, is all down to one. Bringing or letting all come to be the one that it is. As long as our mind is wandering and wavering about this and that, in a sense, we can't really begin the practice. And so the importance of practicing properly with the body, practicing properly with the breath, and of course, practicing properly with our mind, the mental attitude, so to speak. Again, these three, the body and the breath and the mind, reinforce each other by sitting properly. You don't have to sit in full lotus like this, but if you can, you see why it's a very good, perhaps the best way to do this kind of practice, opening up the hips, allowing the belly to be extended, the back is naturally erect. It's a very good way to do what we are doing. In other words, to be clear and yet calm. It's not necessary to sit in this posture. If you can't do it, you can sit truly clear and calm in half lotus or in Burmese with your legs flat on the ground, or on a seiza bench, or using cushions, sitting in a chair, but not leaning your back against it. Perhaps the most important point is for the back to be naturally erect, the head as well, the ears in line with the shoulders, and then breathing. Exaggerating now just so you can see. Giving all to the out breath, not forcing it, but just giving the energy that you have with each out breath and then breathing in again. It's natural and as simple as that. The body, the breath, the mind, the mental attitude, in a way, this is the most difficult, the delicate part of it, Where do we put our mind when we are doing zazen? The point is to bring all into one. So the concentration must be a way that does that. It can't be simply a matter of concentrating on one thing, counting my breath, then concentrating on something else, a koan or something like that. In the beginning, of course, this can be helpful as a process to bring our mind, to focus our mind. But the concentration comes to be one. We all know this whenever we are doing something we really love. We are totally there with it. It's totally unified experience. Zazen is doing that, but without turning it into something, a musical performance that we may really thoroughly enjoy hearing or performing. In Zazen, the mind is completely open in a way that is impossible in ordinary consciousness, completely open. And yet that total focus and concentration is there without grasping on to anything. If a pain arises, we are aware of that. It's there. That's where it is at that moment. If a loud car goes by where you are, you hear that. Your ears are open. But we don't do anything. The mind doesn't react in any way to that. It's fully there, fully there. And that is found to be enough, more than enough. Again, bringing all into one, this concentration naturally develops. It's all one, and yet nothing is excluded, nothing is left out. And of course, when we need to focus on something in particular, the phone rings. Yes, of course, we get up and do what needs to be done. That concentration does that. You see how the breath itself can be helpful in unifying, in bringing all into one, quite naturally. Not thinking about it, but the breath itself. You see how the body, the posture itself is helping us to do that. You see how the mental attitude of allowing the mind to bring all of that energy into one. It's often spoken of as being below the navel in the hara or the tanden, the physical center of the body. But in the beginning, to get out of your head, going into the center of your body is a very natural and good process. You shouldn't get stuck there either, but it's very good to be totally settled physically in the body. And when you sit, you will see from your experience what this is. Then naturally, that concentration grows more and more. You see what a koan is for. It's not absolutely necessary, but a koan is a way of bringing all of it into one. For example, what is this? Or who is this? Not just some kind of mental conundrum or puzzle that you're trying to figure out. It's something that the entire body, breath, and mind, it's almost like being locked into it in a very good way. It comes to encompass everything. Who what? What is lacking? What remains? There are many, many ways to hone it and get it really clear for yourself. It's not good to change from one to another. Once you find the one that really works for you, speaks right into the depths of your being, it brings all of the concentration naturally to bear. Well, this is a helpful koan. Again, it's not necessary. The sitting itself will do. The breath itself will do. But if there is something, when you are really settled in the practice and all is coming naturally to be one, if a question does arise from out of the depths of your being, not something, oh yeah, I read about this or I heard about this. No, it comes naturally from out of the depths of your being. It's almost as if the great faith or trust or confidence that is growing allows you to practice more and more naturally, more and more in accord with the rest of your life. And yet, right in the midst of that great faith and trust and confidence, is something lacking? Or what remains? What remains? You see how this can naturally come out. Again, it's almost the other side of the confidence. Yes, no doubt. And yet, does some doubt remain? You don't have to create it. You don't have to think it up. If it's there, that shows you the way you need to go, to complete, to bring that concentration to its culmination, so to speak. It must reach its culmination, otherwise you know very well from your own experience what happens. It comes together and you have a bit of a glimpse, and that seems to last for a while, but then you get confused again. Maybe you think you're enlightened and then you practice really hard, but it's just a symptom of the dis-ease itself. It will never end that way. So to gather all into one naturally, until what? Until it becomes clear that the one that you have gathered together is always already here. You haven't done a thing, in a sense. As a process, yes, you have, and you need to bring your mind back when it wavers again and again, to bring that focus back, to stop escaping from this. In a sense, that's the beginning of the practice, to stop escaping from what? From this. When it's matured, it's clear beyond a shadow of a doubt. This concentration is not something that we are concocting, creating, developing, even perfecting. On the way, it appears that way, yes, but when it reaches its maturity, it's this. It's this. It's not a state. It's this. It's the mind escaping from this. That's what comes and goes. This concentration doesn't come and go. You must realize this for yourself. Otherwise, you're just a cat chasing its tail. Once again, to see that that concentration naturally becomes total, what it is. To do this, yes, in a sense, self-willed effort is necessary. Not because the practice is so difficult, but because our mind is so used to wandering off. As I often say, that's the frustrating, the difficult part, is the mind running off. In effect, not practicing is the difficult part. When you practice, there's nothing simpler than this. It's not even one. How can this, being in accord with this, the universe smiling at itself. How can that be difficult? It cannot. If it is difficult, see what you are doing wrong and correct it. Huh? Once again, the process of bringing all together, yes, this takes effort, this takes patience, this takes humility. Yes, please give yourself to it thoroughly. Huh? What happens when that concentration is really total and complete? As I already said, one thing that happens is you realize that it is not something you have created. Rather, you are, how to say it, returning to what is really here. A seamless, flawless concentration. When that falls in on itself, so to speak, huh? This is the entrance into real Zen practice. How to say it? It comes to its own end. That concentration, seamless and flawless, comes to its own end. And in a sense, we can say it caves in on itself. When it caves in on itself, what is there? Well, for the self, the ego self, still using its benchmark, its measure, its own standard, it would say, well, when that happens, then there's nothing. And maybe even that sounds scary or threatening because I don't want to lose myself. But of course, that's just viewed from the outside. Huh? You can't use the benchmark of the ego self here. It doesn't work. When this concentration becomes total and complete, and then it naturally caves in on itself, is there nothing? Well, you could just as well say now there's everything. But what is truly everything, not the everything seen as a concept through my own mind. No, it's now what in Buddhism is called the formless universe. Oh, isn't that abstract? No, that's what's really here. That is what the formless universe means. It has not been turned into a form, an object in my mind, which then is just an abstraction, a shadow. No, we come home to this. We don't go to another world, an enlightened world. We truly come home to this. But what this is, is, how to say it, free of form. The form that it has, as a grape, as a pen, as a virus, is the form that it has. But when we really see it from the inside, it's completely without form. It's completely free of form. This is most essential to see with oneself. What am I? 5 foot, 10-inch American, so and so and so and so. Oh, none of that is a lie. But is that me? Is that you? These descriptions can be helpful when you're filling out forms. Yes. But finally, what are we? In Buddhism, it's clear. They speak of it, for example, as without form. I speak of it as being without self. And I trust you can see. This is where compassion, love comes from. This is where creativity comes from. This is where the vitality of life comes from. Please, when you get to that entrance gate, do not stop. This is the beginning of a new kind of practice. Yes, it's a different kind of practice after that, but practice is at least as important then. It's a shame to see people have some experience, but then go off, as we say, half-cocked when they've just entered the gate. This practice, the farther you go, as it said, the farther you go, the deeper it gets. The more you practice, the harder you practice. That hard is in a different sense now. It's not the self banging up against itself, but the harder you practice, the more you realize, the harder you will practice. Well, this is love at work. This is compassion. Let us look once again at this essential practice, gathering all into one, whether we do it with the breath, with a koan, or the sitting itself, but all comes to be the one that it is. When that disappears, when that dissolves, we see what? A new world? Well, we see what has always already been here, but we couldn't really see it. We saw it through a glass darkly, as they say, through a lens darkly. Now, the split that the self is, the split that the self creates and is, me and you, life and death, good and bad, that splits, so to speak. When I was young, we used to speak of splitting. Let's split when you want to just immediately leave without thinking from someplace. This place is a drag, not interesting. Let's split. Well, Zen practice is splitting from this split, the split that the self is. It's seen to be null and void. It is not real. It is not real. And you can confirm it by what we are doing right here and right now. I'm in Japan, thousands of miles away from, I suppose, every one of you. And yet we are not separate by an inch. If we were, how could we be communicating like this, even with the present online situation? Where is the separation between you and me? Consider well in the depths of your practice. Once again, the difficulty of the practice is the wavering self, the self trying to escape because it doesn't know what else to do. That's what's tiring and frustrating. The practice itself cannot be tiring or frustrating. It's not even one. It's the formless universe smiling at itself. That is not tiring. That is not frustrating. If it is, see what you're doing wrong. This is where proper guidance can be really helpful. The work must be done by each and every one of us, but proper guidance from someone who has actually been through it can be really helpful here. Finally, what do you need to realize this? A koan? Not necessarily. Sitting properly? That certainly helps. Breathing properly? I would definitely pay some attention to that. Bringing all into one? Yes, yes, yes. But finally, all you really need is to be sincere in the practice, patient in the practice, and humble in the practice. And I assure you, things become clear. Things become clear. Be patient, not lazy, but patient. That split itself is seen to be null and void. And with that, the universe is experienced, well, as what it is. And you can also say it's new from the ground up. And yet, It's simply what is here, really here, without distinction, without being separate from the other. Oh, you're connected with the other, but you are separate too. It's inevitable for the ego self to be engaged in, but still separate from the world, and to be separate even from what you really are. We all know this. Zen practice is simply a way of letting it come to its own end. When you see from your own experience that this is what must be done, and you are settled in the practice, I'm here for you. We have to be in touch online for some time, but that's okay. It's not the same as actual physical contact, but we will make best use of what we have. The practice is really simple. It's not always easy when the ego is still struggling with itself, fighting with itself, but it is ultimately very, very simple. Again, it's not even one. When the mind lets go of its own self-delusion, its own clinging, trying to find satisfaction in grasping something, although in a way it already knows it doesn't work. It's done it 1,000, 10,000 times. But the point, of course, is the ego self doesn't know how to stop. It doesn't know how to stop because that's what it is. It is that split. So, the marvelous practice of zazen. You see, zazen is not doing a thing with the ego self. It's in a very good way disengaging from the whole delusion. The way we have our body, the way we have our hands, the way we have our eyes, half closed, just looking down naturally in front of us. Everything about the physical, mental, physical posture, the mental attitude, and the breath itself is helping us to realize this, to be what we truly are. It's elegantly simple. It's elegantly simple. If there is a difficulty, a hindrance, an obstruction, respect it. See what it is. Is it merely a delusion you can let go? Or does something need to be seen through? And then move on, move on. See what you are doing wrong and correct it. Keep your heart and your eye open. When you give yourself fully to this practice, it shows you the way you must go. I'd like to leave room for questions for the benefit of all from out of the practice. But first, please feel free to stand up and stretch for a moment. Thank you all for listening so intently.
Somebody has a question, please raise their hand. I'm going to try to switch between screens. Well, I have a question, Jeff. Uh, at least in my case, I have very on the back of my mind the fantasies that illumination or enlightening, it's like um, you're not gonna have psychological problems, um, you're not gonna suffer, never, you know. Once I listened to a talk with my former teacher, and he said, well, Zen Buddhist teachers do suffer. I remember that. So I believe it's a fantasy, you know, what happens? The psychological body gets totally balanced. I think that's not possible, but can be a bit a misunderstanding with that.
It's a good point. I myself struggled for years with this. I was desperate when I went to Japan. It's almost 40 years now. I wasn't interested in those, what I thought of as petty psychological issues. I was going for the big shebang. You know, I was just going to have this enlightenment, this awakening, because then obviously all that other stuff would either be resolved or it would be seen to be empty somehow anyway. You know, they're not real the way this enlightenment thing is real. So forget that stuff and just go for the big bonanza, you know? Well, after years of practicing and struggling and banging up against myself, I realized that this complete commitment to awakening, in a sense, is necessary, but it cannot come at the cost of those other issues. You yourself turned me on some years ago to that book. What was it called?
Spiritual bypass.
Right, spiritual bypass. There's bypassing or bypass. There's actually a term for it where you are avoiding, perhaps it should be called psychological bypass. You're bypassing all of those psychological issues and simply going for some kind of envisioned, imagined enlightenment. And in my case, for sure, I assumed that, as you suggest, right, that will solve all those other problems, or they will be seen to be unreal anyway. This is a very dangerous, in a sense, it's almost a kind of perhaps narcissism under the guise, under the pretending to be spiritual practice. It's not really spiritual practice. You are using the spiritual practice to escape, to avoid something. That is not what it is for. That is not what it is for. Don't misunderstand. I'm not saying we should be sitting here and picking apart all of our psychological issues either. There is a time and a place for this. This is important. And not dealing with those psychological issues, it's fairly common that a person cannot give all of themselves to the spiritual path. Something is in the way. They need to work through that first. On the other hand, there are people who will endlessly go into their psychological issues when you really see it clearly. It's because they're afraid of really dealing with the spiritual one. So their life, their self becomes an endless array almost an endless display of these psychological issues and then endlessly working on them and perfecting them. So please be aware, it can work both ways. An obsession with the psychological issues can actually be an escape from the spiritual path. But the real point, and I really appreciate your bringing this up, Leon, I'm sure this is hitting buttons for many people. The point is, if you're doing the practice properly, those issues can be resolved, and there's not really a contradiction between them. Do you know what I mean? Dealing with the psychological issues, yes, in a way that, how to say, takes them to their root. Then they are not in contradiction to the spiritual path itself. But it does take insight here. I am not a psychologist, so I try not to deal with that when people come to me. There's a time where I will say, well, maybe you should go see a professional therapist about that. That's not my area. So in a way, a distinction needs to be made between the psychological and the spiritual. But practicing properly, they come to be resolved. They come to be resolved. If you're practicing properly, I was surely not when I first came to Japan. I just threw that stuff out of the window, the psychological stuff, but it kept coming back. It kept coming back. And finally, no, I can't do this. I can't run away from this. This has got to be the practice now because this is what's coming up. Again, we don't want to sit and do psychodrama. That's not what zazen is for. But if these issues do genuinely come up, especially if they come up again and again, you need the insight to see, is this just something that I can let go? Or is there something that I really need to look into? Perhaps with a professional. Yes, it's very legitimate. I've often told Leon the well-known story, it's a bit legendary, but where a woman, Kisa Gotami, who had been poor and married into a wealthy family, this is at the time of Gautama Buddha, she was still not respected, even when she married into the family. But eventually she had a child, a baby. Then she was accepted and loved and honored, and she felt part of the family. It was wonderful. Finally, she felt fulfilled as a self. But then the child died. She was so distraught, so overwhelmed that she held the baby and would not let go and went around, we might say crazed, asking anyone, please give me medicine for my child. So, oh, the poor woman, she's out of her mind. Well, eventually someone said, Gautama Buddha, the all-enlightened one, huh? We have to be careful how we use that, right? The all-enlightened one. He didn't have any psychological problems, right? Anyway, the great enlightened Gautama Buddha, he's in the next town. Why don't you go see him? Maybe he has medicine for you. So she immediately goes, is able to meet with Gautama Buddha, explains the same thing. Please give me medicine for my child. Very significant. All of you have read the Buddha Sutras and know well that he might have said, oh, all things are impermanent, subject to birth and death. Let it go, woman, let it go. But what did he do here in this situation? Again, this is according to the early Pali Sutras and commentaries anyway. He actually told a white lie. He said, I will give you medicine. She was overjoyed. He said, all I need is some mustard seed. Mustard seed is like for us having salt and pepper, the common herb, everyone has mustard seed. All I need is some mustard seed, but it must come from a household where no one has ever died, okay? Overjoyed, she ran, still with the baby in her arm, went to the first house in the first village she encountered, said, please, please, could I have some mustard seed for my child? Oh, of course, of course. But has anyone ever died in your family? Well, of course, she has to now hear, yes, actually, my aunt and the cousin and the grandmother, of course. Oh, okay. So she goes to another house, same thing. And of course, you see why I'm telling this story. Gautama Buddha is not denying her deep, deep psychological, even spiritual anguish, agony at the death of her only child. He's not denying it at all, but he's helping her to open up to it. You see, by going around and now having to ask of other people, has anyone ever died in your house? Oh, yes, yes. He cannot, of course, she could not find a house where no one had ever died in the family because it's not possible. Eventually, she realizes. She goes back to, well, first she actually takes the child to the funeral pyre and has the body burned as they would do. And then she returns and to Gautama Buddha. And eventually it said she became awakened. But the reason I tell this story is because of the great psychological insight that Gautama Buddha also had. You see what I mean? He didn't just flatly deny her psychological issue. He allowed her to open up to it, to the truth of it, not as an abstract, truth, but as the fact of each and every one of us. This story is a great inspiration, I think, Leon, to warn us about the dangers of ignoring those psychological issues. If we get awakened, yes, there's a fundamental sense in which we can say the self-delusion is undone. The self-delusion is undone. But that doesn't mean psychologically we become perfect beings. We all have, our past karma, so to speak, issues, perhaps great problems we had to deal with, stigma and other things. Abuse, perhaps, that stuff may still be there and need to be dealt with. Yes, yes. Does that help, Leon, and anyone else? If you would like to chime in, Andrea, I believe the person who is now here through your introduction is a specialist in this area. If he has anything to say, please feel free. Leon or anyone, would you like to
I'm fine,
add your voice?
Jeff. It was very helpful. Thank you.
So I have a question in relation to that. Um, so what you're saying is, despite if you've cleaned the slate, the mirror is gone, and the rational mind is no longer functioning,
The
the
rational
garbage.
mind functions, Max. I had to be here at 7 o'clock this morning. I needed a rational mind for that. What do you mean it disappears?
What I mean is, it's used when it's only necessary.
Yeah, it's not the center of our being, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Uh, where does the garbage that Leon is referring to, where does it remain?
I don't follow you.
Uh, the psychological issues, you said,
Yeah,
the remnants of those issues,
yeah.
where does it remain if the practice is whole and complete?
Mm-hmm. We still live as Gautama Buddha did in this world. We still have a brain. We still have a mind. We still have a memory. We still encounter people that look like other people. And in a sense, that practice is at least as important as the practice leading to the release, the awakening. What to do with the remnants, so to speak, to see. It's true, Gautama Buddha is often depicted as really just he wiped that slate clean and not one particle of dust came again. And perhaps this is an exaggeration that naturally developed as the founder of a religion, or perhaps his awakening was that penetrating. I don't know, but the people I do know who have had a genuine awakening, they still have issues to deal with, but in a sense, they have the real place to deal with it. If they remain, and how can they not, sincere and patient and humble, those blind spots that remain, those patterns that still may arise, this becomes grist for the mill. This is our teacher after awakening. It's not the enemy, Max. It needs to be dealt with in all seriousness and respect.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Yeah. It's true, Max, in a sense, in the complete sunlight of the awakening, at that moment, or an hour, or a day, or a week, or months it may last, you can say truly there is no hindrance whatsoever. None. None at all. How could there be? When one really awakens, when that self-delusion disappears or dissolves, in a sense, you can truly say there is no hindrance whatsoever. Free even from the need to be free. But we still live in this world. Do you follow?
Mm-hmm. But so would you be able to, if you see that you have these issues, just sit longer at the mat and let it burn itself out?
Yes, but just sitting longer at the mat to burn itself out is one way of dealing with certain things. Yes, anger perhaps. But there are other issues, psychological issues, about which that in itself may not do.
Mm-hmm.
It may be better to talk with someone about it, or to do something about it, to realize that you need to write a letter to someone and apologize, or finally accept an apology from someone else. Do you know what I mean? These issues are still there. You follow? They don't just disappear.
Right action, right speech, right
Yes,
thought.
and this becomes your dojo, your place of practice there. Those issues, every last one of them, becomes your teacher.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a really fundamental issue that Leon has brought up, because this idea, right? Because we want it to be something that will solve all our problems. Well, you see how, in a sense, this is pure ego, right? I want to have a problem. I want to have an experience that will then wipe the slate clean, solve all my problems. I won't have any more problems. Well, that's pure ego, isn't it? The bodhisattva gets to the point where he can really be of service to others. You see how different that is?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. Your question is also important, Max, to deepen and clarify it. I appreciate it. Would anyone else like to speak up from your experience, please?
Gerald. Your mic, Gerald. It's
Thank you. I really liked reading the suttas because they show the Buddha being kind of a querulous old man, testy, sometimes makes sarcastic jokes. The picture that comes out is very, very human, after the Enlightenment. And this was good until I came to the Kisagotami story originally. When I first read it, I thought it was very, very cruel. And then many years later, I suffered. And that story brought me a great deal of comfort. So if you think the story is cruel now, wait. It'll catch up to you. I have a different question, or though somewhat related. How do we avoid having patient acceptance turn into just stagnation?
That is a danger. Passive resignation, it cannot be helped. For me, Zen has always been really an inspiration at that point, because perhaps Buddhism in general can tend toward a kind of a resignation. In other words, in early Buddhism, you were literally leaving the world, leaving your family, leaving all of that. You see what I mean? To enter the life of practice, to leave home. Leaving home didn't just mean leaving home, it meant leaving the world, very literally, your status and everything. Huh? You would have a begging bowl, and you would have a robe, something to cut your hair with. That would be about it. Very, very primitive in a sense, basic. Very literally leaving the world, leaving society as well. Perhaps that purity is part of what made Mahayana Buddhism develop. I don't know. It's a very complex story. But to go from there and see what needs to be done. Huh? Do you know what I mean, Gerald?
No.
It is not merely passive resignation, and that's where Zen is so good. You know there's this dynamic, right? There's this activity. I mean, in its most grotesque, they strike people even. They hit, right? Well, what are they doing? They're not just sitting there and saying, can't be helped. The world is corrupt, it's fallen. All we can do is get awakened for ourselves. This is a very unfair way of seeing early Buddhism, but Mahayana Buddhism did sometimes view, you know well, Gerald, the earlier forms of Buddhism as that way, just concerned with the awakening, the release of the individual. And that was seen as not enough, not sufficient. Huh? So there is a dynamic, an activity that comes out of Zen. It must come from the right place. It must come from being without self. But being without self can act in the world, can respond, in a sense, can't help but respond to the needs of the world. This is a very simplistic answer, I admit, Gerald, but does it help point you in the right direction?
I'm a very simple man, thank you.
Well, we have time for one more question before going to zazen. Anybody else? Marta?
Good night, Jeff. You always remind us about the posture. But I have the feeling I am not becoming better with my body. I have the feeling it's worse. I get tired. I'm doing zazen in a chair. It is really hard. So I'm trying, really. and your question, what I am doing bad, what is incorrect, I would like to hear you.
Before you were sitting on the ground, correct, Martha?
Yeah.
So recently you've began sitting on a chair.
Yeah, December from now.
And my Zen intuition tells me that you are growing older. Is that correct?
It's not your intuition. it's, it's really true.
Respect your body and listen to it. Don't be a slave to it, but listen to it. There may come a time when you need to go to a chair, when you need to stop sitting on the floor. Everyone has a different body, huh? Listen to it and respect it. The practice is not a certain posture. So I wonder, Martha, if maybe it's just partly just a matter of getting used to a very different kind of sitting on a chair. So give it some time. If you need to sit in a chair, make sure you're doing it right, and then give it some time. I often hear from people, it takes a while to get used to it. It's very different from sitting on the floor on a cushion. So be patient. And it's clear, Martha, your practice is becoming more and more refined, despite what you have just said.